Gold digger marries my dad 2 years before his death, and now she expects to take over his estate, but she has no clue who really owns it. All right, so here's the deal. My dad's going into hospice next week, and it's been a mess for a while now. I mean, we all knew it was coming, but it doesn't make it any easier, right? Thing is, the house he's living in with his wife Sandy and her two daughters, Tina and Beth, isn't even his house. It's mine. I bought it years ago, but you wouldn't know that by the way they've been acting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind a bit. About 7 years ago, things got rough for my dad after my mom passed away. They'd been together for over 30 years, and when she died, it wrecked him. I mean, it was hard for all of us. But my dad? He fell apart. He lost his job a few months later, couldn't keep up with the rent on their apartment, and got evicted. It was like everything just crumbled at once, and he didn't have anyone else to turn to. I was all he had. So being the only kid in a position to help, I bought him a house. Nothing crazy, just a small place in a quiet older neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, and more importantly, it gave him a roof over his head when he really needed it. He had his dog Charlie too, and honestly, Charlie was like his last connection to my mom. That dog was family to us, you know? It made the whole situation a little easier for him. For the first few years, things were good. Dad was healing, slowly, and the house became his little sanctuary. He got back on his feet as much as anyone could after something like that, and Charlie was always there by his side, keeping him company. I'd visit every weekend, and it became our routine. Charlie would wag his tail like crazy whenever I showed up, and we'd hang out in the backyard, grilling burgers, catching up, just trying to enjoy life again after everything that had happened. Then Sandy came into the picture. They met through some mutual friends, and before I knew it, they were married. I wasn't against it or anything. I mean, I was happy for my dad if this was what he needed. And Sandy seemed all right at first, you know? She was polite, always had a smile, and she seemed like she genuinely cared about my dad. So, when he said she was moving in, I didn't have a problem with it. It's his life, after all, even if it's technically my house. As long as he was happy, that's all that mattered. But here's where things started getting a little weird. First, it was just Sandy moving in. Fine. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter Tina shows up with all her stuff. Like she's moving in too. Now, Tina's in her late 20s, a grown adult. So it's not like she's some kid who needs a place to crash for a weekend. No, she's there to stay. I didn't say anything because, again, it's my dad's life and I wanted to respect that. But still, it was a little strange, right? A few months go by and I start noticing things every time I visit. There's more of Sandy's stuff everywhere. The house, which used to feel like my dad's place, now felt like it was more hers. Whatever, I told myself. Dad's happy, let it be. But then, just when I thought it couldn't get more crowded, Beth, the younger daughter, moves in. Now it's a full house. Sandy, Tina, Beth, and my dad, all under one roof. And you can imagine how that went. At first, I tried to let it go. I mean, yeah, it was weird seeing my dad's home being slowly taken over by Sandy and her daughters, but what could I do? I'm not going to tell my dad how to live his life. But things started getting worse. The vibe in the house shifted. Suddenly, my dad's opinion didn't seem to matter much anymore. Everything was about what Sandy and her daughters wanted. Things were already going downhill with Sandy and her daughters slowly taking over my dad's house. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more annoying, we had the whole mess with Charlie. Let me explain something about Charlie. This dog wasn't just a pet. Charlie was family. My mom loved that dog like he was her baby, and after she passed away, Charlie became my dad's emotional support. It was like Charlie was the one thing keeping him grounded after everything that happened. I know some people don't get that, but if you've ever had a dog, you know what I mean. So, you can imagine how much it pissed me off when Beth, Sandy's youngest daughter, started complaining about Charlie. Like, really? Charlie was old, harmless, and spent 90% of his day either sleeping or chasing his own tail when he wasn't too tired. But one day, out of the blue, Beth comes up with this whole thing about how Charlie makes her uncomfortable. She said she didn't feel safe with him around. Now, I'm not one to dismiss people's fears, but come on. This was Charlie, not some rabid wolf. The guy was 12 years old, could barely make it up the stairs without needing a break, and was about as dangerous as a pillow. I didn't take it seriously at first. Thought maybe she was just being dramatic. But Sandy, of course, jumped in to back her up, making a whole big deal out of it. She started saying that maybe it was time for Charlie to find a new home, like he was some unwanted furniture that needed to be thrown out. That was my breaking point. I could see the stress it was putting on my dad. He wasn't just being asked to give up a dog. He was being asked to give up the last real connection he had to my mom. It broke my heart to see it. But what could I do? I wasn't living there, and Sandy had pretty much taken over the decision-making in the house. I could tell my dad didn't want to get rid of Charlie, but he was tired. He was dealing with his own health issues, and I guess he didn't have the energy to fight back anymore. So, yeah, I stepped in. I told my dad straight up that Charlie could come live with me. I wasn't going to let Sandy or her daughters bully him into giving up that dog. My dad was relieved, but I could tell it still hurt him. I mean, he didn't want to give up Charlie, but he knew it was the only way to stop the constant arguing in the house. Sandy acted like she was doing him some huge favor by letting me take Charlie in, but I knew better. It wasn't about Charlie. It was about control. She and her daughters wanted to be the ones calling all the shots, and Charlie was just another way to push my dad out of the decision-making process in his own home. From that day on, I started bringing Charlie with me every time I visited, and every single time, it was like I was bringing some kind of dangerous animal into the house. Tina and Beth would literally act like Charlie was going to maul them any second. The first time I showed up with him after taking him home, Beth actually screamed when she saw him, like she hadn't lived with this dog for the past few years. Sandy tried to play it off, but you could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked in the door with Charlie trotting behind me. It was ridiculous. Charlie would come in, wagging his little tail, barely noticing them, and all they could do was complain about how scary he was. I'd sit with my dad in the backyard, just like we always did, while Charlie lay there in the grass, not bothering anyone. And yet, every time Beth or Tina would peek out the window, give us this disgusted look, and run off like they were avoiding some kind of attack dog. Honestly, I think they just hated that Charlie was still around because it was a reminder that this was my dad's house, not theirs. Charlie was part of my dad's life, part of my mom's life. And no matter how much they tried to take over, Charlie was a constant reminder that they hadn't completely pushed my dad out yet. But then, one day, Sandy finally said what I knew had been coming. She asked me not to bring Charlie around anymore. I was fuming. Why? I asked. Charlie's not doing anything. He just sits there. She tried to sugarcoat it, saying how Beth still felt uncomfortable and how it was just better if Charlie didn't come over anymore. I could see right through it. This wasn't about Charlie at all. This was about power. She and her daughters had been slowly chipping away at everything that was important to my dad, and now they wanted to get rid of the last thing that connected him to his old life. I was livid, but I didn't want to make things harder for my dad. He was already sick, and the last thing I wanted was to stress him out more. So, I told Sandy straight to her face, Charlie stays. He's not hurting anyone, and if you don't like it, then don't come outside when I visit. She didn't like that, not one bit. But I wasn't backing down. I could tell she wanted to push harder, but I wasn't giving her the chance. From then on, every time I visited, Charlie came with me, and I didn't care what they thought. My dad deserved that much, at least. The tension in the house got worse after that. It was like Sandy and her daughters were just waiting for my dad to be out of the picture so they could fully take over. I could see it in the way they treated him, like he was just some old man taking up space. But as long as Charlie and I were around, they couldn't quite get rid of him entirely. And now, with my dad going into hospice, I can already see the writing on the wall. They think they're going to get the house, that everything's going to belong to them once he's gone. But they're in for a surprise. This is still my house, and Charlie, he's going to outlast all of them. So with my dad going into hospice soon, I knew time was running out to say goodbye properly. It was something I dreaded, but I couldn't put it off anymore. He wasn't doing well, and I needed to see him, especially since I'd been taking care of Charlie ever since Sandy and her daughters basically forced him out. I wanted to bring Charlie to see my dad one last time, let them have their moment before everything went downhill. When I showed up at the house, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were already there. The second I walked in with Charlie by my side, I could feel the tension in the room. You know when you walk into a place and everyone just stops what they're doing? Yeah, it was like that. The vibe was off, but I didn't care. I was there for my dad, not for them. Tina was the first to say something. She looked at Charlie, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Oh great, he brought that stupid dog again." She wasn't even trying to hide the attitude. She acted like Charlie was some kind of wild animal, but the truth is, Charlie was so old at this point, he barely moved unless you coaxed him with a treat or something. But there she was, acting all dramatic, like the dog was going to destroy the house. I took a deep breath and ignored her. I wasn't about to start a fight right then, even though I could feel my blood boiling. I just said, "I'm here to see Dad," and headed straight for his room. I could hear Sandy say something to Beth under her breath as I passed, but I didn't catch all of it. Probably some passive-aggressive comment about me or the dog, but whatever. I didn't have the energy to deal with them. When I got to my dad's room, he was lying in bed, looking frail but still awake. His face lit up when he saw me, and when Charlie trotted in behind me, wagging his tail like crazy, my dad smiled for the first time in weeks. It hit me right then how much my dad had missed Charlie. Charlie immediately jumped up on the bed, which honestly was a struggle for him with how old he was, but he made it. He curled up next to my dad, like they hadn't missed a beat. My dad reached over and scratched behind Charlie's ears, just like he used to. For a few minutes, it was like things were normal again, and I could see how much peace it brought my dad to have Charlie there. We didn't talk much at first. It was one of those moments where words aren't really needed, you know? I just sat there with him, Charlie laying between us, and we stayed like that for a bit. I could tell my dad was weaker than the last time I'd seen him, and it hurt to see him like that, but there was also a kind of relief. At least for those few minutes, he looked happy again. After a while, my dad spoke up. "I've missed this old guy," he said, his voice a little shaky but still carrying that familiar warmth. "It's good to see him again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without choking up. I didn't want to show how emotional I was getting, so I just reached over and patted Charlie on the head. We talked for a bit, about simple things. Memories, stories about Charlie, old family moments from when Mom was still around. It felt good, but it was also bittersweet. The whole time I kept thinking about how this might be the last time I'd ever see my dad like this, awake and aware. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around, even when you know it's coming. And then, of course, Sandy had to ruin it. I was getting ready to leave when she walked in, not even bothering to knock. She glanced at Charlie curled up on the bed next to my dad and immediately looked annoyed. "I thought I asked you not to bring that dog here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd committed some huge crime. I felt the anger bubbling up again, but I stayed calm. "Charlie isn't hurting anyone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad. You've got a problem with that?" Beth, who had followed her mom into the room, piped up from behind her. "Good riddance," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "I'm glad we won't have to deal with him after this." That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up trying to keep my cool, but it wasn't easy. "You know what? I don't care what you think about Charlie. He's family, and he's staying here as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, tough." Sandy looked like she wanted to argue, but my dad cut her off. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Let them be." His voice was soft but firm, and Sandy didn't push it any further. I stayed a little while longer after that, mostly to make sure my dad and Charlie had enough time together. But eventually I had to leave. I knew it was probably the last time I'd bring Charlie over, and I wanted it to end on a good note. As I was walking out, Tina was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, and she barely looked up when I passed. But just as I was about to reach the door, she said, "I can't wait until we never have to see that dog again." I stopped in my tracks, turned around, and just stared at her for a second, trying to decide if I was really going to engage. But then I just said, "You won't have to," and walked out. I didn't need to give them any more of my time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how wrong this all felt. It wasn't just about Charlie. It was about everything. How my dad's house had become something else entirely. How Sandy and her daughters had taken over. How they didn't even seem to care about my dad's condition. It was like they were just waiting for him to die so they could get on with their lives. But the joke's on them. This house isn't theirs, and when the time comes, they're going to find that out the hard way. Update 1. After that last visit with my dad, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around Sandy and her daughters, letting them act like they owned the place while I just stood by. My dad wasn't getting any better, and it was only a matter of time before he was gone. Once that happened, I knew Sandy and her daughters would expect to stay in the house indefinitely, just living there rent-free like they'd been doing for years. I wasn't going to let that happen. But instead of dropping the big bomb on them about the house being mine, I decided to take it step by step. First, I needed to see how they'd react to the idea of paying rent. Maybe, just maybe, they'd show some sign of responsibility and agree to it. But I wasn't holding my breath. So a few days after that emotional visit with my dad, I went back to the house. I walked in, and as usual, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were all hanging out in the living room like they didn't have a care in the world. They were watching some reality show on TV, laughing at something, and it honestly made me mad. My dad was in hospice, and here they were, acting like everything was fine. I took a deep breath and walked into the room. Tina glanced up at me, barely acknowledging that I was there, while Sandy paused the TV, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting their precious showtime. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. I didn't want to start this off on the wrong foot, even though I was already feeling frustrated. Sandy raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's going to happen after my dad passes," I said. I could feel the tension in the room rise instantly. The smiles and laughter disappeared, and suddenly, all eyes were on me. Good. They needed to hear this. I've been thinking about it, and we need to talk about the house, I continued. Specifically, about rent. The word rent hung in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. Beth let out an incredulous laugh. Rent? What are you talking about? I didn't let her get to me. Once Dad passes, things are going to change. If you want to keep living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. I've already talked to a lawyer, and we've worked out a fair amount based on the market value of the house. Beth looked at me like I just insulted her entire existence. Tina sat up straight, ready to jump in with some snarky comment, but Sandy beat her to it. Wait a minute, Sandy said, narrowing her eyes. Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here. I nodded, keeping my voice even. I get that, but I've been covering the costs of this house for years, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a good deal here for a long time, but things are going to have to change. Either you start paying rent, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. The room went dead quiet. I could see the wheels turning in Sandy's head as she tried to process what I was saying. Tina and Beth looked completely blindsided, like the idea of paying rent had never crossed their minds. Of course it hadn't. Why would it, when they'd been living there for free all this time? Finally, Sandy spoke up, her voice sharp. This is James's house. He wanted us to stay here. You're not going to charge us rent after everything we've done for him. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. Look, I'm not trying to make this difficult, but the reality is someone has to take care of the expenses, and it's not going to be me anymore. I've already covered everything up until now, but I can't keep doing that after Dad's gone. You either pay rent or you move out. Those are your options. Tina finally jumped in, her face red with anger. You're unbelievable! We've been living here for years, and now you're trying to make money off us? What kind of person does that to family? I sighed, feeling the frustration building. I'm not trying to make money off anyone. I'm trying to make sure things are handled fairly. I've given you plenty of time, and I'm giving you more time now. 3 months after Dad passes, 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than fair. Beth crossed her arms, glaring at me. So what? You're just going to throw us out if we don't pay? I don't want it to come to that, I said, meeting her glare. But yeah, if you're not willing to pay rent, then you'll have to leave. I can't keep covering the costs for you. Sandy stood up then, trying to play the victim card. I can't believe you do this to us after everything we've done for James. Everything we've done for this family. You're just going to kick us out like we're nothing? I shook my head. I'm not kicking you out. I'm giving you options. But like I said, things are going to change, and you need to be ready for that. I'm giving you 3 months to figure it out. That's more than generous. I could see Tina getting ready to say something else, but I was done with the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to stand there and argue with them all day. So before they could pile on more complaints or guilt trips, I turned and headed for the door. As I left the house, I could still hear them talking, probably trying to figure out how to get around this, how to keep living there for free. But I wasn't going to budge. I'd given them their choices, pay rent or move out, and in 3 months they were going to have to face reality. They just didn't know yet that the house wasn't even my dad's to give them. Update 2. It happened faster than I thought. One day my dad was still hanging on, and the next, he was gone. Even though I knew it was coming, it still hit me like a ton of bricks. Watching him slip away like that wasn't easy, but at least I knew he was at peace now. It was over for him, and the pain he had been living with for so long was finally gone. But after the funeral, I had to deal with the aftermath. And no surprise, Sandy and her daughters, Tina and Beth, were acting like nothing had changed. It was almost as if they'd been waiting for this moment, expecting everything to fall into place for them. Like they were ready to take over now that my dad wasn't around. But they had no idea what was coming. I gave it a few days after the funeral to let things settle down, but I wasn't going to wait too long. The sooner I dealt with this, the better. They were probably expecting to stay in that house forever, free of charge, but I had other plans. So, I went over to the house. When I got there, Sandy was in the living room with Tina and Beth, sitting around like they owned the place. They were laughing about something on the TV, totally ignoring the fact that my dad had just passed. There was no grief, no sadness, just them living their lives like nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway for a second, just watching them. It was surreal, honestly. How could they be so unaffected by everything? I mean, my dad had just died, and here they were, acting like it was just another day. Finally, I cleared my throat and walked in. Sandy turned to look at me, but didn't say anything. Neither did Tina or Beth. They just sat there, waiting. I guess they thought I was there to talk about funeral arrangements or whatever. I took a deep breath. We need to talk about the house. Sandy frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? We've already talked about this. We're staying here just like James wanted. And there it was. The entitlement I had been expecting. I could feel my anger rising, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let them get to me. No, I said, shaking my head. We haven't talked about this. You think you're staying here, but the truth is you're not. This house isn't my dad's. It's mine. I bought it for him after my mom died, and now that he's gone, it goes back to me. The room went dead silent. I could see the shock on Sandy's face, like she had no idea what I was talking about. She blinked a few times before finally saying, "What are you talking about? James never told me that. This is our home." I almost laughed. Yeah, well, he didn't need to tell you. This house was never his to give. I bought it for him to live in after he lost his apartment, but it's been in my name the whole time. And now that he's gone, it's time for you to go too. Tina stood up, looking furious. You can't just kick us out. We've been living here for years. This is our home now. I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. No, it's not your home. You've been living here for free, and I've let it slide because of my dad. But now that he's gone, that stops. You either start paying rent or you leave. You have 3 months to figure it out. They were all stunned. Sandy looked like she was about to cry, but she quickly turned that into anger. You can't do this to us. James wanted us to stay here. I'm sorry, I said, although I didn't really mean it. But that's not how this works. Legally, this is my house, and I'm not going to let you stay here without paying rent. You've been taking advantage of my dad for years, and I'm done letting it happen. Sandy tried to argue, but I wasn't listening anymore. I could feel the tension building in the room, but I wasn't backing down. This was my house, and I had every right to do what I was doing. I've already spoken to my lawyer, I added, pulling out the paperwork to prove it. If you don't believe me, here it is in black and white. I own this house, not you, and not my dad. I've given you 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. After that, if you're not out, I'll have no problem evicting you. Beth was sitting on the couch, staring at the paperwork with her mouth hanging open. This can't be happening, she muttered, looking at Sandy for some kind of reassurance. But Sandy had nothing. She knew it was over. I could see it in her eyes. She had been banking on this house, thinking they could just stay here forever, rent-free. But now, reality was hitting them hard. You've got to be kidding me, Tina said, pacing around the room. After everything we've done for James, you're just throwing us out? I almost laughed again. Everything you've done? You mean disrespecting him, pushing him to get rid of Charlie, and treating him like a guest in his own home? Yeah, real generous of you. They all started talking at once, trying to defend themselves. But I wasn't listening anymore. I'd had enough of their excuses, their entitlement, their complete lack of respect. My dad deserved better, and I wasn't going to let them keep living in this house like they owned it. I've said what I came to say, I told them, turning toward the door. You've got 3 months. After that, we'll see what happens. As I left, I could hear them still arguing behind me, trying to figure out what they were going to do. But that wasn't my problem anymore. They had spent years living off my dad, off of me, and now it was time for them to deal with the consequences. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I walked out of the house. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I had let them take advantage of the situation for too long, and now it was time to take back what was mine. This house wasn't theirs. It never was. And soon enough, they were going to be out of my life for good. Update 3. So after I told Sandy and her daughters they had to move out or start paying rent, I figured that was the end of it. I mean, what else could they do? I had the law on my side, all the paperwork showing I owned the house, and I gave them more than enough time to figure things out. 3 months was fair, right? Well, apparently Sandy didn't think so. Because, get this, she tried to sue me. Yeah, Sandy actually went to a lawyer and filed a lawsuit, claiming she had a right to stay in the house because she was my dad's wife and had been promised it after he died. When I first heard about it, I almost laughed. I got served the paperwork one afternoon while I was at work, and my first reaction was, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, what was she thinking? She knew I owned the house. I'd shown her the documents, spoken to her calmly about it, and even gave her more time than most people would to get her life sorted out. But no, apparently that wasn't enough. She decided to take it to court, thinking she'd somehow win. Now, I've never been a fan of going to court. The whole process is just a headache. But at the same time, I wasn't worried. I had my lawyer lined up and ready to go. And I knew we had everything we needed to shut this thing down before it even got off the ground. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. He was calm about it, probably because this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. He looked over the paperwork Sandy filed and was like, yeah, this isn't going to go anywhere. They don't have a leg to stand on. But even knowing that, I was still annoyed that I had to deal with this at all. I mean, come on. They had already been living in my house rent-free for years. What more did they want? Anyway, the whole thing dragged on for a couple of months. Sandy was making all these claims about how she was promised the house by my dad, even though there was zero paperwork or proof to back that up. She tried to play the grieving widow card, acting like I was this evil guy kicking her out of her home. But the reality was, she had no legal claim to the house at all. During the hearings, I had to sit there and listen to her lawyer try to spin this story about how Sandy and my dad had plans to leave the house to her after he passed and how she had put so much into making it a home for them. Yeah, sure. What she left out was how she and her daughters had taken over the place, treated my dad like a guest in his own house, and tried to get rid of Charlie, my dad's dog. But of course, none of that came up. I kept my cool through most of it. I knew the judge wasn't buying it, and my lawyer was doing a great job shutting down every claim Sandy's lawyer made. We had all the documents to prove that the house was mine, title deeds, bank records, everything. So every time they tried to bring up some promise my dad supposedly made, we hit them with cold, hard facts. One of the more ridiculous moments was when Sandy tried to claim she had made improvements to the house and that she deserved some kind of compensation for that. Improvements? The house was in the same condition it had been in when I bought it. If anything, it was in worse shape because they hadn't taken care of it properly. My lawyer pointed that out, and the judge shut that argument down real fast. And, to make it even better, Sandy's daughters, Tina and Beth, had the nerve to show up in court and act like they were victims in all of this. Tina tried to talk about how they had been living there for years and how it was their home, and I just sat there thinking, you've been living there for free, and now you're trying to act like I owe you something? I wanted to say something, but my lawyer gave me that look that said, let it go, so I stayed quiet. It didn't take long for the judge to make a decision. He basically said what we all knew from the start. Sandy had no claim to the house. There was no will, no written agreement, nothing that showed my dad had ever promised the house to her. And since the house was legally mine, Sandy and her daughters were going to have to move out. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly I wasn't. I knew this was how it would end. The whole lawsuit was just a desperate attempt to hold on to something they never had a right to in the first place. The judge gave them a final deadline, 2 weeks to move out, or the eviction process would start. When we walked out of the courtroom, Sandy wouldn't even look at me. She just stormed off with Tina and Beth trailing behind her, all of them acting like I had done something horrible to them. But I didn't feel bad. I'd given them more time and more chances than they deserved, and they still tried to screw me over. In the end, they didn't have much of a choice. After the court ruling, they packed up and left. I didn't hear from them again after that. No more phone calls, no more texts, nothing. It was like they disappeared, and honestly, I was relieved. The whole thing had been a nightmare, but now it was over. The house was finally mine again, and I didn't have to deal with their drama anymore. Sure, it had been a long, exhausting process, but I came out on top. And Sandy, well, she lost. It didn't matter what promises she thought my dad made. In the end, the law was the law, and she couldn't change that. So yeah, she tried to sue me, and she lost. Now the house is mine, and they're gone for good. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted. Golden Boy Bro wrecked my startup, so I ditched my toxic family for good. Alright, so let me start by saying this. I've hated my younger brother Matt for as long as I can remember. I'm 33 now and he's 30, but it doesn't matter how old we get, he's always been a thorn in my side. And I'm not just saying that in a casual, oh, siblings fight sometimes kind of way. I mean, I really hate the guy. Always have. And honestly, I think I've got some pretty solid reasons for feeling that way. So a little background first. Growing up, our parents treated Matt like he was the second coming of royalty. They made it painfully clear that he was their favorite, their golden boy. They never even tried to hide it. Me? I was just the extra, the guy they tolerated but never really cared about. It's like no matter what I did, I was never good enough. Meanwhile, Matt could do the bare minimum, sometimes not even that, and get praised like he just cured cancer or something. I get it, some parents have favorites, but this wasn't just favoritism. This was full-blown worship. And to make it worse, we come from a pretty old-school, traditional family. Our parents are immigrants, and in their culture, the son is basically treated like a king. Doesn't matter if he's a screw-up. If he's a guy, he's automatically more important. Growing up, that was drilled into me every single day. Matt could have burned down the house, and my parents would have been like, oh, he's just expressing himself. I, on the other hand, couldn't do anything right. Ever. It wasn't always like this, though. When we were younger, I tried to make things work with him, tried to be the good older brother. But as we got older, Matt became more and more of a jerk. He knew he was the favorite, and man, did he lean into it hard. The guy thrived off being the center of attention. He'd constantly overshadow me, no matter what I achieved. And I achieved a lot. I was always the one working hard in school, getting good grades, getting my degree, while Matt coasted by, partying and barely passing classes. But guess who got all the praise? Yep, not me. One example that's burned into my brain is my 18th birthday. It was supposed to be a big deal, right? I had a bunch of friends over, my family was there. It was meant to be a fun time. But then, right in the middle of the party, Matt decides that this is the perfect moment to announce that he's dating some college senior and plans on dropping out of high school to go live with her. I don't know if you've ever witnessed a full-blown family meltdown, but that's exactly what happened. My parents freaked out, our relatives freaked out, and suddenly my birthday didn't matter. At all. Everything became about Matt's big decision. And to top it all off, the whole thing turned out to be a lie. He was just doing it for attention, just to ruin my moment. I should have seen it coming, honestly. That's just who Matt is. Everything has to be about him, all the time. And the worst part is, my parents fed into it. They didn't even try to punish him for ruining my birthday. Nope, they just coddled him like usual. It was always like that. But anyway, fast forward a few years, I'm out of the house, got into business school, graduated with honors, and started working in a decent paying job. Meanwhile, Matt, he barely graduated high school, partied his way through his 20s, and was still mooching off our parents. He did a couple of odd jobs here and there, but nothing serious. But despite all that, my parents acted like he was some sort of business prodigy. They even went as far as throwing him a huge going-away party when he pretended to move out for college. When I left for school, my parents threw a small dinner with like 5 people. But for Matt, they rented out a freaking restaurant and invited everyone they knew. Typical, right? Anyway, I didn't let it bother me too much back then. I figured once I was out on my own, I wouldn't have to deal with the constant comparisons and the blatant favoritism anymore. And for a while, I didn't. I worked hard, saved up money, and finally came up with an idea for my own business. I spent months working on the plan with my business partner, Eric. We put together a killer proposal, and I thought, okay, maybe this is my shot. Maybe I can actually make something of myself without relying on anyone else. But here's where things go off the rails. After months of work, I figured I'd pitch the idea to my parents. My dad was always decent in business, and I thought, hey, maybe they'll want to invest. Maybe they'll actually support me this time. I mean, I didn't have high hopes, but it was worth a shot, right? And to my surprise, they were into it. They said they'd invest, help me get things going. I was over the moon. It felt like, for the first time in my life, they were actually backing me. But then Matt happened. I don't know what kind of twisted satisfaction he gets from screwing me over, but the guy convinced my parents that investing in my business was a bad idea. He told them that it was too risky, that I didn't have what it takes to succeed, and that they should pull out before they lost any money. The worst part? They listened to him. Just like that, all the promises they made, the money they said they'd invest, it was all gone. And this wasn't just casual talk. This was after I'd quit my job, after Eric and I had put everything on the line. I remember sitting in their living room trying to process what they were telling me. My dad just looked at me and said, "We've reconsidered. Matt thinks this isn't a good idea." That's it. No discussion, no warning, just blindsided me with it. I was furious. I mean, here I was, ready to start something that could have been huge, and they pulled the rug out from under me because my idiot brother had a bad feeling about it. I don't think I've ever been that angry in my life. I told them exactly what I thought of them, of Matt, of everything. I stormed out of the house and didn't look back. From that moment on, I was done with them. I couldn't believe that after everything I'd worked for, they'd still side with Matt. It wasn't just about the money. It was about them never believing in me, never seeing me as more than second best. And so, that was it. I cut them off completely. I didn't need their support. And I sure as hell didn't need Matt sabotaging everything I worked for. I was done. And looking back, it was probably the best decision I ever made. So after that whole disaster with Matt and my parents pulling out of my business deal, I was wrecked. Like, seriously. I had no idea what to do next. I had already quit my job and there was no going back to that. My business partner, Eric, was freaking out too. But he's the type of guy who tries to keep it together, you know? He just kept saying stuff like, "We'll figure it out, man." Even though I could tell he wasn't really sure how we were going to do that. Honestly, at that moment, I just felt completely screwed. I spent the next few days just sitting at home, going through everything in my head, trying to piece together how I got myself into this mess. It wasn't like I hadn't put in the work. I mean, I spent months building this business plan from the ground up, and it was solid. I had proof of concept, a detailed financial model, even a couple of smaller investors who were ready to chip in. But my parents were supposed to be the big piece, the ones who'd give us the boost we needed to get off the ground. And now? Now it was gone. All because Matt said I was going to fail. I kept replaying that conversation in my head, like, how could they just drop everything without even telling me why until I forced it out of them? I guess that's just how deep their blind trust in Matt goes. They believed him over me again. That realization stung the most, like I was never going to be seen as capable or even equal to him in their eyes. But I couldn't stay in that mindset forever. Eric and I had to regroup. Fast. We started talking about next steps. The first thing we needed to figure out was whether we could salvage any of the investors we had lined up. The smaller ones, who were willing to take a risk on us, but weren't going to be able to give us nearly as much as my parents would have. So we sat down and started making calls. And let me tell you, cold calling potential investors when you've just had your biggest financial backing fall through, it's not fun. It was basically a marathon of, sorry, we can't help, and maybe next time. The first few calls were brutal, and I could feel my hope draining with each rejection. But then, one day we got a call back from this small firm we'd pitched to a while back. They weren't offering anything huge, but it was something. It was enough to keep us from completely sinking, and at that point, that's all I needed. Eric and I jumped at the opportunity. We reworked our entire budget, cut costs, and decided we'd go lean until we could prove the business could stand on its own. It wasn't what we planned, but it was better than nothing. So we kept grinding, putting in long hours, trying to make sure every penny was accounted for. Here's the thing, though. Those first few months? Absolute hell. There were moments when I thought we were done for, like the entire business was going to crash and burn before we even got started. I couldn't sleep. I'd stay up all night worrying about whether we'd made the right choice, if we should have just thrown in the towel and gone back to our old jobs. But the thought of giving up made me sick. I'd already lost my family's support. I wasn't going to lose this too. This was all I had left. So Eric and I pushed through, running on fumes, trying to make it work. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. We had to cut back on so many things we thought we needed. At one point, we were literally working out of a friend's basement because we couldn't afford office space anymore. But I wasn't complaining. We were still moving forward, even if it was slower than we expected. A few months in, something crazy happened. We got our first big client. I'm talking huge. We had been networking like crazy, trying to make connections with anyone who would hear us out. And somehow, it paid off. This client saw potential in what we were doing and decided to take a chance on us. It wasn't just a lifeline. It was the break we needed. The money started coming in, slowly at first, but it was enough to get us out of survival mode. We started building momentum, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I actually felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to make it. But of course, things couldn't stay smooth for long. Right when we were starting to hit our stride, guess who comes crawling back into the picture? Yep, Matt. One day, out of nowhere, I get a text from him. It was weird because we hadn't spoken since I blew up at our parents'. The text just said, "Hey, can we talk?" Like, really? Talk? After everything that happened? I almost didn't respond, but curiosity got the better of me. So I texted back, "About what?" He calls me, and I pick up, half expecting some apology or explanation. But nope. Turns out Matt had his own little disaster brewing. He didn't say much at first, just danced around the topic. But eventually he let it slip that he was in deep trouble with his own finances. Apparently he had made some bad investments, big shocker there, and was up to his neck in debt. And now he wanted my help. I couldn't believe the nerve of this guy. After he'd sabotaged my business, after he convinced my parents to screw me over, now he wanted me to bail him out? I was floored. I mean, what did he expect me to say? Sure, bro. Let me help you out after you ruined my life. Yeah, no. I flat out told him that wasn't happening. I wasn't his safety net. And if he was in trouble, that was on him. He tried to argue, saying that we were brothers, and that we should help each other out. I just laughed and hung up. There was no way in hell I was falling for that. After that call, I felt this weird sense of relief, like, finally, I was done with all of them. I wasn't tied to my family anymore, wasn't caught up in their drama. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd survived without them, and now I didn't need them for anything. Eric and I kept growing the business. We hired a few employees, moved into a proper office, and started expanding. It was hard, but it was also the most rewarding thing I'd ever done. And every time I looked at how far we'd come, I knew it was because I didn't let Matt or my parents drag me down. I was free finally, and it felt damn good. Update 1. All right, so let me tell you about the time my parents and Matt came crawling back into my life. By this point, I hadn't spoken to any of them in almost 3 years. After the whole business sabotage thing, I cut them off completely, and honestly, it felt great. I didn't need their negativity, and I was doing just fine on my own. My business was starting to take off. Eric and I were getting new clients, and I was finally starting to feel like all the hard work was paying off. Life was pretty good. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I'm just chilling at home, thinking it's going to be a quiet day. But suddenly, there's a knock at the door. Now, I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was kind of confused. I opened the door, and guess who's standing there? My parents. I kid you not, it was like seeing ghosts. I hadn't heard from them since that last argument where I told them to basically get lost, and now, here they were, standing on my doorstep like nothing had happened. At first, I didn't know what to say. I just stood there staring at them, waiting for one of them to say something. My dad finally broke the silence, giving me this awkward smile and saying, "Can we come in?" Honestly, I didn't even want to let them in, but curiosity got the better of me. So I stepped aside and let them into my apartment. We sat down in the living room, and I was still waiting for some kind of explanation, maybe even an apology. But no. Instead, they start making small talk, asking me how I've been, how the business is going, all that fake "we care about you" stuff. I wasn't buying it. I knew they had to have some kind of agenda because there's no way they just showed up out of the blue after all this time to see how I was doing. After what felt like forever, my dad finally got to the point. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "We've been hearing about your success, your business. It's doing well, isn't it?" The moment those words left his mouth, I knew exactly where this was going. I just nodded, staying silent, because I wanted to see how far they'd take this. My mom jumped in next, saying, "We've been thinking, now that things are going so well for you, maybe it's time for us to be involved. We could invest, help you grow even bigger." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These were the same people who had pulled out at the last minute and nearly tanked my entire business. And now that they saw I was making it work, they wanted back in? I didn't know whether to laugh or scream, but I kept my cool. I looked at them and said, "You want to invest in my business? Now? After you bailed on me when I needed you the most?" My dad tried to explain it away, saying something like, "Well, we weren't sure back then, but now we can see you've proven yourself." As if that was supposed to make everything okay. I wasn't having any of it. I told them flat out that I didn't need their money and that I wasn't interested in their support. I reminded them how they left me high and dry when I was desperate for help, and now that I was succeeding without them, they wanted to ride the wave. The more I talked, the more uncomfortable they got. My mom started tearing up, saying, "But we're your parents. We just want to be a part of your success." I wasn't falling for that guilt trip. I could see right through it. They didn't care about me or my success. They cared about being associated with it. They wanted the bragging rights, the chance to tell everyone that they had a hand in building something great, even though they had nothing to do with it. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I told them they could leave and that I had nothing more to say. My dad, looking frustrated, tried one last time to convince me. He said, "You don't understand. We're family. You're supposed to let us help." That's when I lost it. I snapped and said, "You weren't family when you bailed on me, so don't pull the family card now." I told them that they had made their choice years ago, and now they had to live with it. They weren't getting a second chance to screw me over. At that point, my mom was full on crying, saying things like, "I always knew this would happen. You've changed. College changed you. You're too independent now." She said they never should have let me go to school, that if I had stayed home, I would have known my place and wouldn't be acting so ungrateful. I just stood there, speechless for a second. It was like everything she said confirmed what I'd always known. My success wasn't what they cared about. What they really wanted was control. If I had failed, I would have been dependent on them. And that's what they wanted. They couldn't stand the idea that I had done it without them. I told them to leave one last time, and this time, my dad finally got the message. He stood up, pulling my mom up with him, and they left without another word. As soon as the door shut behind them, I felt this weird mix of relief and anger. I was glad they were gone, but part of me couldn't believe how blind they were to what they'd done. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? But no, Matt had to get involved. A couple of hours later, I get a call from an unknown number. I knew who it was before I even picked up. It was Matt. He started going off immediately, accusing me of disrespecting our parents and saying that I owed them an apology. He was talking like I had committed some crime, telling me that I needed to make things right with them because they raised me, and that I wouldn't be where I am without them. I couldn't help but laugh. I told him straight up that I didn't owe them anything, least of all an apology. I reminded him of how he sabotaged me, how he convinced them to pull their investment, and how I had made it without any help from them. He didn't have much to say after that, just a bunch of weak excuses about how he never meant to hurt me and that family should stick together. I hung up. I didn't need to hear any more of his BS. I was done with all of them. They made their choices, and I made mine. After that day, I blocked all their numbers. I didn't want to give them another chance to weasel their way back into my life. And honestly, I've never looked back. I built something on my own, without them, and I wasn't about to let them take any credit for it now. That's the thing with family. They think they can mess with you, but when you finally stand up for yourself, they act like you're the problem. Well, not anymore. I'm done with them, and I'm better off for it. Update 2. All right, so after that last stunt with my parents showing up at my place, I thought things would calm down. I mean, I figured after I told them to get lost, they'd finally take the hint and just leave me alone. But man, I was wrong. Turns out the story wasn't quite over yet, and it was Matt who came crashing down this time. So a few weeks go by and everything's pretty quiet. Business is going well. Eric and I are busy with new clients, and honestly, life's good. I hadn't heard a word from my parents or Matt since I blocked them, and it was honestly like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. No drama, no guilt trips, nothing. Just peace. But of course, peace doesn't last long when you've got a brother like Matt. One day, out of the blue, yeah, I said it, sorry, I get a call from a mutual friend, Jake. Now, Jake's not really in my close circle or anything, but he's one of those guys who keeps in touch with everyone. He's the type who knows what's going on in people's lives, whether you want him to or not. Anyway, he calls me up and says, "Hey man, did you hear what's going on with Matt?" Now, my first thought was, why the hell would I care? But Jake's the kind of guy who can't keep anything to himself. So he starts spilling the details without me even asking. Turns out Matt's life was going down the drain. And when I say down the drain, I mean fast. Apparently his whole business that he'd been bragging about to my parents for years, yeah, that was a complete lie. He wasn't running anything. He'd been living off loans and handouts from my parents and, get this, racking up a massive amount of debt. I knew Matt wasn't exactly the most responsible guy, but even I didn't expect things to be this bad. According to Jake, he had made some really bad investment choices. Surprise, surprise, and had lost most of the money he got from my parents. He had also borrowed a ton of cash from shady places, and now the whole thing was catching up with him. Debt collectors were knocking on his door, and he had no way to pay them back. I couldn't help but laugh when Jake told me all this. I mean, this was the same guy who had convinced my parents to pull out of my business because he thought I'd fail. And now look who's drowning in debt. Karma's a funny thing, huh? But here's the kicker. My parents had no idea how bad things were for Matt. He'd been hiding the whole mess from them, still pretending everything was fine. They were under the impression that he was some big-shot entrepreneur when, in reality, he was barely hanging on. I guess that's why he was so desperate to get involved in my business. He saw it as his way out, his way to cover up the disaster he'd created for himself. Anyway, after Jake fills me in, I just go on with my day. It wasn't my problem, and I wasn't about to get involved. Matt dug his own grave, and I wasn't going to be the one to pull him out of it. But of course, things didn't stay quiet for long. A couple of days later, I get a frantic call from my mom. She's crying, which wasn't exactly a shocker at this point, but she's going on and on about how Matt's in trouble, how he's in over his head with money issues, and how they're losing everything because of him. I didn't say anything at first, just listened as she went on about how they had bailed Matt out of debt multiple times, and now they were struggling to keep up. My dad had even started dipping into their retirement savings to cover for Matt. They were about to lose their house because they'd taken out loans against it to keep Matt afloat. It was a complete financial nightmare. Then she hit me with it. She asked if I could help. Yep. After everything, after all the crap they put me through, my mom actually asked if I could help Matt. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it or make it about family. No, she straight up said, "We need money to help Matt out of this situation." I just sat there for a minute, trying to wrap my head around the fact that she was even asking me this. I told her, flat out, that I wasn't giving them a single dime. I wasn't about to bail Matt out of his mess, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them guilt trip me into it. I said, "You chose him over me every single time. Now you can deal with it." My mom didn't take that well. She started crying harder, going on about how they were going to lose everything and how Matt didn't mean for things to get this bad. But I wasn't budging. I told her they made their choice when they backed Matt and screwed me over. Now they had to live with the consequences. After that call, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally understand where I was coming from. But nope. The next day, I got a text from my dad asking if I'd reconsider. He tried to hit me with the whole family helps family line, saying that Matt needed me and that they were all in this together. But I knew better. This wasn't about family. This was about them refusing to admit they'd been wrong about Matt. They were trying to clean up his mess just like they always had. And now that they were sinking, they wanted me to jump in and save them. I didn't respond to the text. I didn't need to. They could keep digging that hole if they wanted to, but I wasn't about to jump in after them. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that Matt had to sell his car to pay off some of his debts. It wasn't enough to cover everything, though, and now he was getting desperate. My parents were still trying to keep up appearances, pretending everything was fine to the rest of the family. But I knew it was just a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed. And honestly, I didn't feel bad for him. Not one bit. Matt had spent his whole life coasting by, relying on everyone else to clean up his messes. He had sabotaged me, lied to our parents, and now he was paying the price. The last I heard, Matt was considering moving back in with my parents because he couldn't afford rent anymore. They were scrambling to keep their house, barely making ends meet because they were still bailing him out at every turn. It was honestly pathetic. But here's the thing. I'm not going to be the one who saves them. I've built my own life, my own success, and I've done it without their help. If they want to keep sinking money into Matt's bottomless pit, that's their choice. But they're not taking me down with them. And that, my friends, is what happens when you put all your faith in the wrong person. Update 3. So, after everything that went down with Matt and my parents, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Like, surely they'd finally realize I wasn't going to swoop in and save them from their mess. But of course, that's not how things work in my family. I swear, every time I thought I'd cut ties for good, something would pull me right back into the chaos. A couple of months after I told my parents I wasn't helping them with Matt's financial disaster, I got a call from my Aunt Linda. Now, Aunt Linda's always been the one person in my family who I actually liked. She was more down to earth and never really bought into the whole Matt is a genius narrative my parents pushed. So when she called, I figured it might be something important. The first thing she said when I picked up was, "You might want to sit down for this." And that's never a good way to start a conversation, right? I wasn't sitting, though, and I told her to just spit it out. That's when she hit me with it. "Your parents are selling their house." At first, I wasn't sure if I heard her right. Selling the house? The same house they had sworn they'd never leave? The one they'd spent years telling everyone would stay in the family forever? I asked her why, but deep down, I already knew. Turns out, things had gotten worse for Matt. Like, way worse. He hadn't just racked up debt with some sketchy lenders. He was now being sued by one of the businesses he tried to partner with. And my parents had no choice but to sell the house to cover the legal fees and whatever was left of his debts. I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there listening to Aunt Linda lay out the whole mess. My parents were in total denial, apparently still convinced that Matt was just going through a rough patch and that things would turn around for him. They were selling their house, their retirement savings were gone, and they still thought Matt would somehow get back on track. It was crazy. My parents had always been pretty stubborn, but this was next-level delusion. I mean, they were literally throwing away everything they had to save a guy who didn't care. And the worst part? Matt wasn't even living with them anymore. He'd skipped town, probably to avoid all the people he owed money to. I asked Aunt Linda why she was telling me all this. Like, what did she expect me to do about it? And that's when she dropped another bombshell. My parents had been telling the rest of the family that I was the one refusing to help them, that I was the selfish son who wouldn't lift a finger to save the family home. I felt my blood boil. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, minding my own business, staying out of their mess, and now they were dragging my name through the mud to cover for Matt's screw-ups. Aunt Linda said she didn't believe them, but apparently a lot of the family did. I guess it was easier for my parents to paint me as the villain than to admit they'd screwed up by putting all their faith in Matt. After that call, I had to sit down and think about what to do next. I mean, part of me just wanted to walk away and never deal with them again. But another part of me was pissed that they were smearing my name to cover up their own mistakes. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called my parents. I hadn't spoken to them since they asked for money months ago, but I needed to hear their side of the story. When my mom picked up, she sounded like she'd been crying. She didn't even say hello. The first thing out of her mouth was, "Are you calling to help?" I couldn't believe it. Even after everything, she still thought I might swoop in and save the day. I asked her straight up, "Are you telling the family that I refused to help you save the house?" She hesitated. That told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't about to let her weasel her way out of this, so I pressed her harder. I told her I knew about the lies they'd been spreading, and that I wasn't going to sit back while they made me look like the bad guy. Finally, she broke down and admitted it. She said they didn't know what else to do. They were desperate, and they thought if they made me look bad enough, maybe I'd feel guilty and step in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her there was no chance in hell I'd ever help them now. Not after all the lies and manipulation. Then my dad got on the phone and things got heated fast. He started yelling, saying that I had abandoned the family and that Matt was still my brother, no matter what. He said I owed it to them to help fix things because family sticks together. That was the last straw for me. I told him he made his choice years ago when he sided with Matt. I reminded him how they threw me under the bus to protect their golden child and how they've been enabling Matt's failures for years. I told him they were only reaping what they'd sown and that it wasn't my job to clean up their mess. My dad tried to argue, but I wasn't listening anymore. I told him this was the last time we'd ever speak and that if they needed help, they could go ask Matt. After all, he was their favorite, right? I hung up before he could say anything else. I blocked both their numbers after that. I was done, for real this time. A couple of weeks later, Aunt Linda called me again. She said my parents sold the house and were moving into a small apartment. They had barely enough to cover their bills now, and Matt? He hadn't even bothered to show up. Last anyone heard, he was living with some friend in another city, still avoiding his problems. I guess that's what happens when you put all your faith in the wrong person. My parents lost everything trying to save Matt, and now they had nothing left. Meanwhile, I was building a life for myself, one they had no part in. And you know what? I didn't feel bad. Not even a little. In the end, they made their choice, and so did I. And I'm finally at peace with that.
My name is Lucy, and I'm 29 years old. I've always been a dedicated and hardworking woman. I've spent the last few years building my career in the marketing field, and I've always thought of myself as independent, someone who could take on whatever life threw my way. I'm married to Ethan, who's 32. We've been together for 3 years, and while I love him, there are times when I feel like we're not on the same page. We've talked about having children before, but lately, the subject has been weighing heavily on my mind, and I feel like we're stuck in a never-ending cycle of back and forth. Ethan is an ambitious man, driven by his career goals, much like me. He's always been focused on saving money, buying a house, and ensuring our future before adding more to our family. I understand the logic behind his reasoning, but lately, I've been feeling an intense desire to start a family. We've been renting a small apartment for the last couple of years, and it's fine, but it doesn't feel like our forever home. I've always dreamed of being a mother, but whenever I bring it up, Ethan quickly shuts it down. "We'll get there when we're ready," he says, but the more time that passes, the more frustrated I feel. It's as though my desire for children isn't being taken seriously, and it's starting to eat away at me. We've spent the last few months living in this tension. We both work long hours, barely seeing each other during the week, and when we do spend time together, the topic of children is always avoided. One night, over dinner, I brought it up again, hoping Ethan might see things differently. "I know we've talked about this before, but I feel like we're running out of time. I want to have a baby soon," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Ethan looked up from his plate, his expression unchanged. "We're not ready for that yet. We need a bigger house, Lucy. You know that." His words were calm, but they hit me hard. He didn't even seem to consider how I felt, just repeating the same thing over and over. It wasn't just Ethan who was making things difficult. His parents, who live nearby, have been asking us every time we visit them when we're going to have children. They don't seem to understand why we're waiting, and their questions have started to feel like pressure. "It's been a year since you two got married," his mother would say with a smile. "When are we going to hear the good news?" Ethan would stay quiet, his eyes on the ground, as though hoping the conversation would just pass by. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted him to stand up for us, to defend our choices. But he never did. The pressure from his parents, combined with Ethan's refusal to even discuss having children, began to feel suffocating. One evening, his mother even pulled me aside, saying, "Lucy, don't you want to be a real wife? Maybe it's time you quit that job and focus on starting a family." Her words felt like a slap across my face. I've always been proud of my career, and the idea of giving it up just to fit into some ideal of womanhood didn't sit well with me. It was always Ethan who encouraged me to work and pursue my ambitions. But now, it felt as though his family was telling me I wasn't good enough unless I was barefoot and pregnant. I snapped. "If you're so concerned about us having a baby, why don't you talk to your son instead of blaming me for everything?" My voice was louder than I meant it to be, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. I stood up from the table and walked out, feeling a wave of anger rush over me. I wanted to scream at Ethan, to tell him that this wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about me wanting to start a family, to share a life with him. But he just didn't get it. Outside, I found Ethan smoking by the door as if nothing had happened. I couldn't understand how he could be so calm after everything. "Are we leaving now?" he asked, his voice casual. I didn't even know how to respond. My frustration was at its breaking point. I climbed into the car without saying a word. It was clear to me that Ethan wasn't listening, and I had had enough. "I'm not going to your parents' house anymore," I said firmly. Ethan looked at me, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "What do you mean? We save money by eating there. And besides, you want a house and kids, right?" His words were like a dagger to my heart. He wasn't hearing me, and it seemed as though all he cared about was the house. I felt like a failure, trapped in a situation where my voice didn't matter. "If saving money is so important," I continued, "why don't you cut back on your drinking with friends or smoking? Why don't you make sacrifices instead of just blaming me for everything?" His response was as dismissive as always. "It's not a big deal," he said, but to me it was. "It is a big deal, Ethan," I snapped, the tears threatening to spill over. "I can't keep doing this. If you want to save money, then you need to make changes too. You can't expect me to carry the entire load." That night, things between us reached a boiling point. I was so tired of being the one to compromise, to follow the rules while he continued to live as though nothing had changed. I wanted a family, but it felt like Ethan didn't care about my feelings anymore. We had talked about this for so long, but his solution was always the same. Wait until we have a house. Then, something unexpected happened that changed everything. My uncle, who had been living in a luxurious mansion on a large piece of land, passed away. Ethan and I were never particularly close with my uncle, but the news of his death stirred something in me. A few days later, I learned that my uncle had left me his inheritance: property, land, and a substantial amount of money. Ethan didn't understand why I was so focused on this inheritance. To him, it was just another way to get what he wanted: money to build a house. When I received the news, I decided to meet with the lawyer to discuss the details. I didn't want Ethan involved in this. It was something personal for me, and I didn't need his opinion on how I should use it. When I politely asked him to leave the room during the meeting, he didn't seem to take it well, but I didn't care. I needed to think clearly and make decisions that were right for me. That meeting, though, made me reflect on everything. Ethan's behavior, the constant pressure to wait for a house, his refusal to compromise, and his assumptions about money, had worn me down. It felt like he was only interested in my uncle's inheritance because it could help him achieve his goal of building a house. It was frustrating, but it also made me realize that I had been putting my own needs aside for too long. A few months later, Ethan surprised me with an unexpected visit to a new house. We drove to a residential area, and I was confused when he parked in front of a house I didn't recognize. His parents greeted us at the door, and that's when things took an even stranger turn. This wasn't their house. It was a new place that Ethan had secretly bought, and he expected us to move in together. "This is our new home," he said casually, as if I should be excited. "We'll live here, and you can work things out with my parents on the baby issue." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He hadn't even consulted me about this decision. He just went ahead and bought a house without discussing it with me. I felt completely betrayed. I had already told him I didn't want to visit his parents anymore, let alone live with them, but Ethan didn't seem to care. He was so focused on his plan, so convinced that this was the best course of action, that he hadn't even considered how I felt. I was speechless, and the anger bubbled up inside of me. "You bought this house without asking me first?" I asked, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. "And now you want me to live here with your parents?" Ethan shrugged as though it was no big deal. You want kids, don't you? This is the solution, he said, his voice completely calm. But to me, it wasn't a solution. It was a control tactic. The conversation only got worse. Ethan assumed I would use my inheritance to pay him back for the house. The house is expensive, but it'll all work out if you just use the inheritance money, he said, completely ignoring the fact that the inheritance wasn't just mine to spend however I wanted. When I rejected his suggestion, Ethan became angry, and in that moment, I realized that our marriage was beyond repair. He handed me a pre-filled divorce form, his name already written on it. If you don't want to live with my parents, then let's just get a divorce, he said coldly. I didn't even hesitate. Fine, I said, my voice steady. If that's the way it has to be, then I'll sign the papers. I left. I packed my things and filed for divorce. I had finally realized that I couldn't keep living in this controlling, suffocating relationship. I needed to take control of my own life. For the first time, I felt free.
My sister slept with my ex and got pregnant. Then my family demanded I give up my inheritance. All right, so here's how it all started. I'm 24 now, but this whole mess began a couple of years ago. Back then, I was in this relationship with a guy I met in college. Let's call him Jake. We hit it off pretty quickly. He seemed nice, thoughtful, and we had a lot in common. At first, things were going great. I mean, I was head over heels for him, and I thought this was the guy I was going to marry one day. So naturally, after about a year together, I decided it was time to introduce him to my family. Now, my family's a little, let's say, traditional. We're from a pretty conservative culture, and they have strong opinions about who you should date, how you should date, and when you should get married. They weren't thrilled when they met Jake. It wasn't like they were rude to him or anything, but I could tell they didn't really like him either. They didn't say much, just kind of gave me that, "Are you sure about this guy?" Look, I brushed it off, thinking they'd come around eventually. But here's the thing. While my parents were lukewarm about Jake, my sisters seemed to love him. Grace, who's 22, and Emma, who's only 11, got along with him great. That made me happy because, family approval matters even if it's just my sisters. Grace especially seemed to really enjoy his company, and we even joked that she was stealing my boyfriend. Emma adored him too, but she's just a kid, so it didn't feel weird. Jake and I didn't live together because in my culture, that's a huge no-no unless you're married. So we worked in different cities and would meet up when we could, but I thought things were solid between us. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my boyfriend, and he seemed to get along with the people closest to me. What could go wrong, right? Well, 3 months after Jake met my family, things took a turn. I was over at his place for the weekend. We'd had a normal day, nothing special. Grabbed food, watched a movie, the usual. He went to take a shower and his phone buzzed. Now, I'm not the type to go snooping through someone's phone. I really believe that if you trust someone, there's no need for that. But something that day just didn't sit right with me. His phone kept buzzing, and I don't know why, but I picked it up. Maybe part of me already knew something was off, or maybe I was just curious. When I unlocked it, I saw a message from Grace. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, she's my sister. But when I opened the chat, my heart basically stopped. The messages weren't normal. They were flirty, like let's hook up level flirty. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My sister and my boyfriend. I started scrolling up through the conversation, and it got worse. There were months of this stuff, late night messages, inside jokes that I didn't know about, and even plans to meet up behind my back. I felt sick. Like, how long had this been going on? The person I trusted most and my own sister? I took screenshots of everything. My hands were shaking and I couldn't think straight, but I knew I needed proof. I sent the screenshots to myself and just left his place without saying a word. I didn't wait for him to get out of the shower. I didn't give him the chance to explain or lie to me. I just bolted. As soon as I got home, my phone started blowing up with calls and texts from Jake. He must have realized something was wrong when he saw that I'd left. I ignored everything. I couldn't even look at my phone without wanting to scream. Eventually, I sent the screenshots to our friend group's chat and blocked him. I didn't care about the fallout at that point. I was done. I had no patience for lies or betrayal. But what hit me the hardest was Grace. I mean, Jake's betrayal hurt like hell. But Grace? That was another level of pain. She wasn't just my sister. We grew up practically inseparable. With our parents being absent and wrapped up in their own world most of the time, Grace and I had always leaned on each other. We were only 2 years apart, and we had always been there for each other. Or so I thought. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and flew straight back home to confront her. I didn't care what kind of scene I was about to make. This was bigger than just a fight. It felt like my whole world was crashing down. When I walked into my parents' house, Grace was there like nothing had happened, just sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling on her phone. I slammed the screenshots down on the table in front of her. Our mom and dad were both there too. Grace didn't even try to deny it. She just looked at the messages and shrugged like it was no big deal. She actually said, "Yeah, I did it. So what?" I wanted to scream. How could she act like this didn't matter? Like she hadn't just destroyed our relationship for good. My mom lost it. She slapped Grace across the face, something I had never seen her do. My dad was furious too, yelling at Grace, telling her to get out of the house. He gave her a week to move out, and I thought that was it. I thought maybe this was the end of all the drama. But 2 days later, Grace dropped another bomb on us. She was pregnant, with Jake's baby. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This had gone from bad to worse in a matter of days. My parents, who had been so angry with her, suddenly softened up. They couldn't stay mad at her once they knew she was pregnant. And just like that, the whole dynamic shifted. It was like Grace was off the hook just because she was having a baby. My parents started talking about how they couldn't abandon her now, how they had to support her, no matter what she did. That's when I snapped. I told them all exactly what I thought, how they were enabling her, how this was all messed up. They tried to tell me to calm down, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, told them to never contact me again, and I left. The only one I didn't block was Emma. She's just a kid, and I didn't want to cut her off too. 2 weeks later, my mom somehow got a new number and sent me a wedding invitation. Jake and Grace were getting married, and my mom had the nerve to act like I should be there for family unity or whatever. I told her to get lost and blocked her again. That's how it all began. I thought the worst was behind me, but little did I know the real mess was only getting started. After all that went down with Grace, my ex, and my parents, I thought cutting them off would give me some peace. Turns out life had other plans. I wasn't speaking to anyone except Emma, and I was trying to just move forward with my life, you know? But of course, things never go that smoothly when you've got a family like mine. About 2 months after I blocked everyone, I started hearing things through the grapevine. A cousin of mine, who I stayed in touch with, mentioned that Grace was having a baby shower and my parents were throwing it. Apparently, they had invited a ton of people, like it was some huge celebration. At first, I wasn't surprised. I figured they'd make a big deal about it since they were acting like Grace was some kind of victim. But then, my cousin hit me with something that really got under my skin. She told me they had started telling people that I was the one who abandoned the family, and Grace was the good daughter who was trying to keep the family together. Seriously? After everything she did, she was somehow the hero of this story now? I was so mad, I wanted to call my mom and just let her have it. But I knew better than to get dragged back into all that. I stayed quiet, tried to keep my head down, but that didn't mean I wasn't fuming on the inside. The nerve they had to spin this whole thing around like I was the problem. A few days later, I got a text from Emma. She was just giving me an update on how things were going at home, but she also dropped something I wasn't ready for. My mom had apparently been going around telling people that I needed to get married soon. Not for any real reason, just because she didn't want people gossiping about how Grace, the younger sister, was getting married and having a kid before me. Like what? I hadn't even spoken to them in months, and now they were worried about my reputation? It was ridiculous, but that's how my mom's mind worked. Everything was about appearances. She didn't care about what Grace did to me. No, the bigger issue was how it looked to other people. I wasn't living my life on her timeline, and that was apparently some huge scandal. And yeah, that made me furious. But more than that, it made me sad. It was like nothing I ever did was going to be enough for them. Even when I cut them off, they still found a way to control the narrative, to make me look like the bad guy. So, fast forward a bit, Grace's wedding happened. Obviously, I didn't go, but I heard all about it from my cousin. Apparently, it was this big, fancy thing. My parents went all out, even though Grace was barely a few months pregnant. They made sure to cover up the whole scandal by telling everyone they were just being responsible, getting married quickly so the baby wouldn't be born out of wedlock. My cousin told me my parents were telling everyone I didn't show up because of work commitments. Yeah, right. But you know what really hit me hard? It wasn't just that they were lying to cover up their own embarrassment. It was that they were still pretending everything was perfect. Like, they couldn't even admit that their family was falling apart. They couldn't just be real about what was happening. Instead, they had to put on this fake show for everyone else. I was done with them at this point, but hearing about all this still stung. It was like they were erasing me from the family narrative completely. Anyway, time passed and I tried to move on. I threw myself into work and focused on building a life for myself. For a while, things were quiet. I wasn't hearing much from my family, and I figured maybe they had finally just left me alone. But of course, that's not how it works in my family. One night, I got a call from Emma. It was late and I was about to go to bed, but something about the way the phone rang gave me a bad feeling. When I picked up, Emma was crying. She could barely get the words out, but eventually she told me that our dad had passed away. I was stunned. I mean, I didn't have the best relationship with him, but still, he was my dad. What really pissed me off, though, was that it was Emma who had to call me. My mom didn't even bother. I hadn't heard a word from her. Emma told me that our dad had been sick for a while, but they hadn't told me. My mom decided to keep it from me because she didn't want to stress me out. Can you believe that? My own father was sick, and they didn't think I had the right to know? The next morning, I booked a flight back home. I didn't care about all the drama anymore. I just wanted to be there for Emma. When I showed up at my parents' house, it was like walking into a battlefield. My mom and Grace were there, and the first thing they did when they saw me was start yelling. They accused me of only coming back for the money, like that was the only reason I'd want to be there. Grace was especially nasty, calling me selfish, saying I abandoned them when they needed me most. I didn't even get the chance to grieve. Everyone was so focused on the inheritance, on who was getting what, that they barely even talked about Dad. It was disgusting. And as if things weren't bad enough, when they read the will, all hell broke loose. Turns out, Dad had left me the largest share of his assets. I was shocked. I wasn't expecting anything from him, especially after how things had gone down. But there it was, in writing. I got 40%, Emma got 30%, Mom got 20%, and Grace, she got 10%. You'd think I'd feel relieved, right? Like finally, some justice. But honestly, it just made things worse. Grace and her husband lost it. They started demanding that I give up my share, saying I didn't deserve it, that Grace needed the money more because of her kid. They even threatened to take me to court over it. I knew they didn't have a legal leg to stand on, but the fact that they were willing to go that far just showed how greedy they were. It was all about money to them. They didn't care about family or what was right. They just wanted to get their hands on whatever they could. I told them I wasn't giving up anything, and that's when things got nasty. Grace's husband started making threats, saying I'd regret it if I didn't do what they wanted. I knew it was all just talk, but still, it was unsettling. I was already dealing with the loss of my dad, and now I had to put up with this crap on top of it. It was too much. After the will reading, I went back to my hotel to clear my head. I thought about everything that had happened, all the lies, the betrayal, the greed, and I realized something. I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. I'd spent too long letting my family control my life, and it was time to stand up for myself. Update 1. So, after the whole inheritance blow-up, I thought things couldn't possibly get worse. I mean, they already accused me of coming back just for the money, and Grace and her husband were trying to bully me into giving up my share. But I wasn't going to budge. I knew I had the legal right to what my dad left me, and honestly, after everything they put me through, there was no way I was giving in. Anyway, a couple of days after the will reading, I got a message from my lawyer. We had a meeting scheduled to go over some more details about the estate, and honestly, I just wanted to get it over with. I was tired of all the drama and just wanted to settle everything so I could go back to my life. But when I got to the lawyer's office, he hit me with something I wasn't expecting. Turns out, my dad had written me a letter before he passed away. The lawyer handed it to me and said that my dad had asked him to give it to me when the time was right. I sat there for a minute, just staring at the envelope, not sure if I even wanted to open it. I had so many mixed feelings about my dad, like, yeah, he left me the largest share in the will, but he also never really stood up for me when all the crap with Grace went down. I was angry with him, but at the same time I missed him. It's hard to explain. So I finally opened the letter. It wasn't long, just a couple of paragraphs, but what he said kind of hit me. He apologized for not being there for me when I needed him. He said he knew he should have done more, but he felt trapped by the situation with my mom and Grace. He admitted he had regrets, especially about how things ended between us. Reading that, I didn't know whether to cry or be angry. Part of me felt a little bit of closure, but another part of me was just pissed that he didn't say any of this while he was alive. After reading the letter, the lawyer and I went over a few more things about the estate, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about how different things might have been if my dad had just spoken up sooner. If he had stood up for me instead of staying silent, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess right now. But it was too late for all that, and there was nothing I could do to change the past. On my way back to the hotel, I got a call from Emma. She was really upset because apparently Grace had been saying some pretty nasty things about me around town. She was telling people that I was trying to steal the inheritance and that I was turning the family against her. I wasn't surprised, honestly. Grace always knew how to play the victim and make herself look like the innocent one. But it still hurt to hear that she was spreading lies about me. When I got back to the hotel, I decided to take a break from all the drama and spend some time with Emma. I picked her up, and we went out for dinner. We talked about everything that had been happening, and I tried to reassure her that none of this was her fault. She was just caught in the middle of all this, and I hated that she had to deal with it. But the next day, things took another turn for the worse. I woke up to a bunch of missed calls and texts from unknown numbers. At first, I thought it was just spam, but then I started reading the messages. They were all threatening, calling me names, and accusing me of trying to tear the family apart. Someone even said they were going to make me pay if I didn't back down. I had no idea who was behind it, but I had a feeling Grace's husband was involved. He had already threatened me once, and I wouldn't put it past him to try something like this. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, just in case things escalated. But honestly, it was starting to get really scary. It's one thing to deal with family drama, but when people start making threats, it's a whole other level. Later that afternoon, I went to my car, only to find that someone had slashed my tires. All four of them. I was completely freaked out at this point. I mean, who does that? I knew Grace and her husband were angry, but this felt way too extreme. It was like they were willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted. I called the police and filed a report, but I didn't have much hope that they'd catch whoever did it. Still, I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. I was already dealing with enough, and the last thing I needed was to be scared every time I walked out the door. I talked to the hotel staff, and they beefed up security around the property, so that made me feel a little better. But it was clear this wasn't going to end anytime soon. A few days later, we had another meeting with the lawyer to finalize some things with the estate. Grace and her husband were there, and the tension in the room was thick. They barely said a word to me, but the glares they were giving me said enough. At the end of the meeting, Grace's husband pulled me aside and told me I was making a huge mistake by not giving up my share. He said I'd regret it and that this wasn't over. I didn't even bother responding. I just walked away. I wasn't going to let him scare me into doing something I didn't want to do. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. Grace and her husband weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and I had to be prepared for whatever came next. That night, I sat down and thought about everything that had happened since my dad passed. The lies, the threats, the vandalism. It was all so exhausting. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to move on with my life and leave all this behind. But I knew that wasn't going to happen as long as Grace and her husband were around. Still, I wasn't going to give up. I'd been through too much to let them push me around now. They could make all the threats they wanted, but I wasn't backing down. This was my life, my inheritance, and I was going to fight for what was mine. And if they thought they could scare me into submission, they were in for a rude awakening. Update 2. Things didn't calm down after that last meeting with the lawyer. If anything, they got worse. Grace and her husband were getting more and more desperate, and honestly, it was starting to feel like I was in the middle of some bad movie. The threats kept coming, the nasty texts from random numbers didn't stop, and I was just mentally drained. One night, about a week after the tire slashing incident, I was heading back to the hotel after dinner with Emma. She had been staying over with me for a few days, which was honestly a relief. It was nice to have someone on my side in all this mess. We were walking through the lobby when I noticed this guy just standing there, watching us. At first I thought maybe he was just some random person waiting for someone, but when we passed by, he followed us. I tried not to freak out, but the whole situation had me on edge already. We got into the elevator, and as soon as the doors closed, I looked at Emma. "Did you see that guy?" I asked. She nodded, looking just as nervous as I felt. Yeah, he was staring at us. We got to our room, and I immediately called the front desk to report the guy. They said they'd check the cameras and send someone up to patrol the floor, but still, it didn't make me feel much better. This whole thing was getting way too close for comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's husband was behind this somehow. I mean, who else would go to these lengths just to scare me? That night, I barely slept. Every little noise had me jumping out of bed, convinced someone was trying to break in or worse. It was like living in a nightmare, and all I could think about was how to make it stop. The next morning, I decided I needed to take some serious action. I called my lawyer and told him everything about the threats, the weird guy in the lobby, the slashed tires. He agreed that things were getting out of hand and suggested we get a restraining order against Grace's husband. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but at that point, it felt like the only option. We filed the paperwork the next day, and I tried to keep my head down while we waited for the court date. But of course, Grace and her husband didn't take the news well. The texts ramped up again, this time with more threats about how I'd regret this, and how they'd make sure I paid for everything. It was exhausting, but I was done being scared. They could throw whatever they wanted at me, but I wasn't giving in. A few days later, the court date for the restraining order came around. I showed up with my lawyer, and guess who else was there? Grace and her husband, of course. They looked smug, like they thought this whole thing was a joke. I avoided eye contact with them, focusing on what my lawyer was saying, but I could feel their eyes on me the whole time. When the judge called us up, Grace's husband tried to act like I was the one causing all the drama. He said I was exaggerating everything, that I was just bitter about the inheritance and trying to make his life hell. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like, really? He slashes my tires, sends me threats, and somehow I'm the one causing problems? Thankfully, the judge saw through his BS. After hearing both sides, they granted the restraining order, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small sense of relief. At least now there was something in place to protect me if things got worse. But of course, things didn't magically get better overnight. The threats didn't stop right away, and I still felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. But at least now I had the law on my side, and that gave me some peace of mind. A few weeks passed, and I was finally starting to feel like maybe things were settling down. I was still staying in the hotel, but I had started looking for a new apartment where I could feel safer. Emma had gone back home, and I missed her, but we kept in touch constantly. She was still dealing with the fallout from all the family drama, but at least she wasn't stuck in the middle of it as much as I was. Then, one morning, I woke up to a message from an unknown number. It wasn't a threat this time, though. It was a link. I hesitated for a second before clicking on it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Someone had created a whole website dedicated to trashing me. I'm talking lies, half-truths, and just pure nastiness. They were painting me as this selfish, greedy person who was tearing the family apart. There were even photos of me from the funeral, looking cold and heartless, according to the captions. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was next-level crazy. I immediately called my lawyer and sent him the link. He told me to screenshot everything, which I did, and then we started the process of getting the website taken down. It was just another reminder that Grace and her husband weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But at this point, I was so tired, I didn't even care what they threw at me anymore. I just wanted it to be over. That night, I talked to Emma again. She was upset about the website and wanted to help, but there wasn't much she could do. I didn't want her getting caught up in all this any more than she already was. We talked for a while, and she told me about how Grace had been acting like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't caused any of this. Typical Grace, always playing the victim. I went to bed that night feeling drained, but at least I had a plan in place. The website would get taken down, the restraining order was in effect, and I had people on my side. I wasn't alone in this, even though it felt like it sometimes. The next day, I woke up to an email from my lawyer saying the website had been taken down. Finally, some good news. It felt like a small victory in this endless battle, but I'd take what I could get. I knew Grace and her husband weren't going to give up easily, but at least now I had some control over the situation. As I sat in my hotel room that morning, sipping on my coffee and trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened, I realized something. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry, yes, but the fear that had been hanging over me for weeks had started to fade. I wasn't going to let them control my life anymore. They could try all they wanted to drag me down, but I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Update 3. So here we are at the final stretch, and I thought maybe things were going to finally settle down after the court win. But nope, my family drama had other plans. I mean, I knew Grace and her husband weren't going to back off that easily, but even I couldn't have guessed how far they'd take it this time. It started about 2 weeks after the court hearing. I was starting to feel a little more relaxed, like I could finally breathe again without constantly looking over my shoulder. I was even thinking about moving out of the hotel and into an apartment, something more permanent. But then, something weird happened. One morning, I got a package delivered to my hotel. It didn't have a return address, which should have been my first clue that something was off. I opened it up, and inside was this old, beat-up notebook. At first, I thought it was just junk. Maybe some random person sent the wrong package or something. But then I opened it up, and that's when things got creepy. The entire notebook was filled with handwritten notes about me. I'm talking pages and pages of scribbled messages, all about my life, my family, and even things about my dad's will. Some of the notes were dates and times of where I'd been, who I'd been with, even places I'd gone with Emma. Someone had been keeping tabs on me, and it was all laid out right there in front of me. I felt a chill go down my spine. Who would send me this? Was it some sort of twisted intimidation tactic from Grace's husband? I mean, they'd already tried the threats, the vandalism, even the weird phone calls. But this was different. This felt way more personal, like someone was watching me, tracking my every move. I called my lawyer immediately and sent him photos of the notebook. He was just as freaked out as I was and told me to report it to the police, which I did. They took the notebook as evidence, but I wasn't holding my breath for anything to come of it. The police had their hands full with a million other things, and honestly, I didn't think they'd figure out who was behind this anytime soon. After that, I tried to keep a low profile, staying in my hotel room most of the time and only going out when I absolutely had to. Emma was still calling me regularly, and she was worried too. She had no idea who could be behind the notebook either, but she suspected Grace's husband, just like I did. Then, one evening, as I was heading back to my room after grabbing some food, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. That same guy from the hotel lobby weeks ago, the one who had been watching Emma and me, was back. He was standing near the elevators, pretending to scroll through his phone, but he was definitely keeping an eye on me. I felt my heart start to race, but I played it cool. I walked right past him, pretending like I didn't notice anything, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Once I got into my room, I locked the door and immediately called hotel security. They said they'd check the cameras and send someone up to do a sweep of the floor, but honestly, I didn't feel safe there anymore. I called Emma that night and told her everything. She was scared, which made me even more anxious. I hated that she was caught up in all this, that she had to deal with the fallout of Grace's mess. But I promised her I'd be careful, and we made a plan to meet up the next day so we could figure out what to do next. The following day, I met Emma at a cafe downtown, away from the hotel. We sat there for a couple of hours, talking about everything. She told me more about what had been going on with Grace at home, how she was acting like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just tried to take me to court over the will. It was infuriating, but it didn't surprise me. Then Emma dropped something on me that I wasn't ready for. She said Grace's husband had been asking around about my whereabouts, trying to figure out where I was staying. That's when it hit me. The guy at the hotel, the notebook, all of it. They were keeping tabs on me, and they were probably planning something worse. I knew I couldn't stay at the hotel anymore. It wasn't safe, and if Grace's husband had people watching me, it was only a matter of time before things escalated. So, that night, I packed up my things and checked out of the hotel. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Emma, just in case. I booked a room at a different hotel on the other side of town, hoping that would throw them off for a while. The next couple of days were quiet. I didn't hear anything from Grace or her husband, and the weird texts and calls seemed to have stopped. But I wasn't letting my guard down. I knew better than that by now. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from my lawyer. He had some news that caught me completely off guard. Grace's husband had been arrested. Apparently, he'd been caught trying to break into my old hotel room. I didn't know what he was planning to do, but whatever it was, he got busted before he could follow through. I felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that he was finally out of the picture, but anger that it had come to this. I mean, what kind of person goes that far just for some inheritance money? It was insane. The police told me they were investigating, and I'd probably have to go to court again to testify, but at least now I knew I was safe, at least for the time being. After that, things finally started to calm down. The police kept me updated on the case, and my lawyer was confident that Grace's husband wouldn't be able to pull anything like this again, not with the charges he was facing. I moved into a new apartment a few weeks later, somewhere Grace and her husband didn't know about. I kept in touch with Emma, of course, but I made sure she didn't tell anyone where I was living. I wasn't taking any chances. It's been a few months now, and while I'd like to say everything is back to normal, I don't think it ever will be. There's still a part of me that's always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if Grace or her husband will try something again. But for now, I'm just trying to move on with my life, to rebuild after everything they put me through. Looking back, I can't believe how far this all went. It started with Grace betraying me with my boyfriend, and somehow it escalated into threats, court battles, and restraining orders. But through it all, I've learned something important. I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. And no matter what, I'm never letting anyone take advantage of me again.